So, said I wouldn't say so. There are a couple pandemic issues I found based on my research so far. Is one, on Mercury, there is such a high amount of radiation that's emitted that I guess the lack of ozone in the sky allows that radiation to go to Earth and produce all of this radiation in the air during the day, generally because Mercury is closer to the sun, so it's not the sun itself, but it's because Mercury is in front of the sun most of the year, I think. And uh, also, it rotates around the sun much faster than the Earth. So it means that throughout the year there could be higher levels of radiation depending on how close the planet is to Earth and also the time of day. Meaning, generally during the day would be when Mercury is in front of the Earth or facing the Earth and or facing you on the Earth. And also, I found there's the dwarf planet on Ceres. It has these giant blue luminescent lights that have this toxic clay, and it has these parasitical organisms will that thrive in high radioactive environments and I think create wormholes by eating metaphysical layers that can cause mental illnesses in people and where they feel like their thoughts need to be said out loud or all of these things that could be related to someone being psychic isn't really psychic in of themselves. It's more of they just have a higher awareness of metaphysics and that there are all these holes in reality, and because of those holes, those people that are more aware can see through them like a keyhole of like maybe looking into people's minds or the future or things like that. But it's not natural, and it's not even because they're highly skilled as a psychic or anything. It's because there are all these wormholes. And there are all of these benefits in modern technology with all of this knowledge and media with entertainment, but I'm finding the reason it existed was originally it was because of I think a divine orchestra of ideas of trying to propagate some cause of rehabilitating the earth. But now it seems like it's more going in the hands of the diseases that uh, all of these branches of knowledge that can be accessed with media. I think that knowledge that isn't meant to be attained by people have been created by these holes in reality by these parasitical organisms. And I'm finding a couple of ways to treat this. Is one, they cause cancer, and they look like black worms. So, like in the Maze Runner, there are these creatures called reavers, and there are these metal balls of goo that can roll around and have these like daggers and swords and these sharp teeth, and they just massacre people, and they're very fast and slimy. But the weird thing about them in the story is that even though they look like organisms, when the characters looked on their insides, they were machines. And it's like, how could something biological be controlled by a machine? But it turns out that I think from thinking about it, of like real life, is that organic materials are just highly unstable inorganic materials. And they have such a short half life that that's what makes them organic. But I'm thinking maybe organic elements aren't natural in general. So that means a half life is referred to as generally the atrophy rate, or the which is can be caused by radiation. So radiation can, I think, create a half life, or I think increase its half life, possibly, allowing it to break down faster. So what I'm realizing now, the issue with people, I think with age, why people generally age the same length, is that here is annoying me. Stupid. Is their organic material is contains the same half life. So like the average time of like 60 years or whatever is probably like either, I don't know if I would say the half life, but maybe more of like the amount of, like, there probably was like a half life is the amount of time a material takes to degrade. Like, is it by half or something, whatever. But it's like radioactive decay rate. And with age, though, people generally get worse as they get older, but it's not like the age limit is the same as when they start getting worse. So I'd be inclined to think that the half-life of the organic material that determines the human lifespan isn't 60 years, but it probably has reached that half-life, I think, at least a couple times before 60 years, which a half-life, uh, like the decay rate halves each time. It's what a half-life means. So like if the half-life is 30 years, then it takes 15 years to decay at the same rate as that 30 years, I think. And it just keeps doubling like that. So it's like the balance of like masculinity and femininity, whatever, is like the reason it's based on twos is sort of like the story I had before with the chisel and mallet, of it being in twos. That the stone man is the fairy tale I made, is that the chisel, well, it kind of reminds me of change, like in money, which is metal, is that it's based on only two numbers. So it's that change is never generally given in three numbers, it's always two. So like, I think how numbers actually work isn't like math, it's by the symbolism in each separate number. So like adding 1 to 1 would be 11. In math it's 2, but I think in the real world it would be 1 1. So it's all of this randomness in nature based on all of these different values of these random numbers that seem extremely complicated. I think if you laid them out and based it on that system of number arrangements rather than using math, then you would find that it's extremely simple. And that's why I think it's ridiculous with how complicated people make math now. while I did all of my research without using any math at all. And I was very good at math in school. I was advanced like 2 or 3 years in algebra, and I got all A's and things like that. But like I hated math, even though I was good at it, and I never did it again after I quit. Like uh, I had to do this accounting class that I hated that teacher, and I was like, I'm just going to make myself learn it and try accounting because that's what my grandpa did, and because he thought it was easy. And I'm just going to make myself do it. And uh, I'm just going to make myself do the math. And after about 5 minutes, I didn't even do a math problem because he explained it so poorly that I had no idea what he was saying. And I can listen to Rudolf Steiner with no problem at all, but with that accounting teacher, I couldn't understand anything he said. And I never did a math problem in that class, and I failed because I hated him. And let's see, it reminds me of a simulation game I was going to make. Did some drawings with it around the time I first watched the show Arcane about a year ago in March. Let's see, so it's like I drew these symbols. Remember doing this. This was over a year ago. Of like these, some form of crystallization of physics manifesting into metaphysics. It's like these symbols mean something. I think this one is important somehow. I did this a long time ago. And I was studying about trying to intertwine physics into metaphysics, which means turning the metaphysical ideas or reality into the physical one, which is like the physics of spirituality, which is what metaphysics is. And I learned some of that from Rudolf Steiner, but most of this was all of it was my own research. And I was studying how sound is the most effective medium for it's the only definitive thing I found that is in between the physical and metaphysical realm or realms. And so that's why there's so much depth to music, even though the notes themselves aren't very complicated. It's because it's a real interaction that's happening, and that's why it feels so deep. It's because it's real and that it's a real physical thing that's happening. But I'm not sure it's based on the words, though. That's why when you listen to a song, you can listen to it and not pay attention to what the lyrics are saying and still feel it. It's because it's not really based on the speech. Like, it's something that surpasses language. And I discovered this thing in Star Wars. It's called I forgot what they're called, but the Force in Star Wars is determined by the amount of this organism that exists in all life. And Anakin Skywalker has the highest amount of any Jedi. And there are these organisms that can allow you to use the force. And I found that there's actually a similar organism to that in real life. Remember, they look like they have, it's like a large circle in the middle, four circles around, and these webs or strings or tentacles on the outside. So kind of like with Slenderman, kind of where you see like those tentacles. It's like that, kind of. But I called them the tiny crystal people, and I'm not sure why I called them the tiny crystal people instead of tiny crystal creatures. But I think it might be because they kind of like with cookie molds where they're in the shape of something, they actually can morph into the shape of things and create DNA. So they're actually literally turning into the shapes. But based on how accurate they are to each other, based on creating those shapes, they can form a crystallization and allow better communication. So, like, every tiny crystal person that looks exactly the same everywhere in the universe has a form of bond or connection that allows them to communicate. And I called the realm that they live in is the unseen. So they exist in between the physical and metaphysical realm, which is also called the dream realm. And in that place, like time, I found is gravity. So in this place, there is no time. So that's where there's the idea of time travel is this place that exists in the dream realm. And I know that time doesn't really abide there because I've had dreams, like I have lucid dreams every night. And I've had dreams that lasted maybe like 2 weeks. So it felt like 2 real weeks, and I was only asleep maybe like 7 hours. And that's happened a lot of times. So like I physically feel have lived longer than like my actual body somehow. It's a very surreal experience. But I was studying things like blocks, how the use of blocks for like cubes or squares, I'm not sure. I was figuring out if building with squares or cubes was like the perfect shape for like the arcane. And I was studying that for like months of studying like 2-dimensional elements versus 3-dimensional ones. And there's a shape I remember that's like this V shape where I remember it being a helmet of the character like Erazar. So like this V, this trifold V shape. And as I used to think of it as like Pyramid Head from the Silent Hill, where it looks like that. But then, like, as I imagined it more in my head, I realized that it's a cube. It's just angled. And uh, it's like here's a cube for a head. but it's something I studied about using the 1 bit experiments of using black and white over color and turning everything 1 bit, which is just everything is made of black and white dots. And when you have that, you can actually create pictures out of what look like stars. And I found that seems to create like the most realistic form of graphics somehow. So like I learned a way to increase the resolution of images that were blurry by turning them into 1 bit. So I actually could turn like low resolution images into high resolution ones by turning them into just a composition of black of white dots arranged on a purely black background. And I found that it was 2D was that like with the head of like why would it be a cube? It's like I learned that masculinity is at 90-degree angles, and the feminism side is always angular. So like if something's rotated, like I noticed all of these images of people posing like in video games or magazines or whatever. There seems to be these like arcane archetypes for posing. So like people pose like this or just like straight up facing the front or their head down. And based on those positions, it actually has a different arcane meaning. So I found every time it's completely a 90-degree angle, like the front, a left, the side, then, or like your head bowed all the way, then it's masculinity. So, like, the ultimate symbolism of masculinity in like the Bible was kneeling down to God and bowing your head, and that would be bending your head down at 90 degrees. And just so you know, masculinity and femininity doesn't necessarily mean gender. It's like people, like male or female, have different amounts of masculinity or femininity, whatever. But generally, people seem to not understand that and confuse them as each other, which I think is what is currently happening in the world, and is why there's so much like gender confusion. It has nothing to do with sexual related things. It's purely about, I think, mistaking masculine and feminine energy as a sex drive or attraction to other people. And part of that I'm realizing is because of the disease that exists that feeds on testosterone and well, just like sexual energy in general. And like cancer, I know, feeds on testosterone, and men are at a much higher risk, I think, of developing more aggressive forms of cancer than women are. And but also the Reich machine can be used for that, which is what I've been doing, which is why I'm sick. And the Reich machine with the frequencies basically uses sound. It's the frequencies are just sound. Like everything in the physical world is just sound. Like it's just sound that combines a metaphysical image and vibrates it to create a physical material, which is what electromagnetic fields are, with you not being able to pass through an object, is because the sound is so loud at the same frequency as the object being pushed against it, that they resist each other because they can't physically occupy the same space. So when there's some form of energy with touching it, that's the same frequency. So obviously from that you would think like there's a shared frequency of every physical thing because everything touches each other. So the question is like what frequency is that? And I'm thinking that it is in a specific material form of that frequency. And that frequency is the material I've been trying to find to, I think, restore the balance on the planet or whatever purposes I would have. But is the point is with the angles, with the femininity and the angling, I think is that I was kidding. There's a diamond. Reminds me of a diamond of crystals. So like metals generally are like front facing and angular. Like diamonds, for example, with what I know, are always like tilted. So you imagine diamond, just a square. I can't make it with my hand, and it's maybe, and it's tilted, and so it's like I think based on my ideas of studying the origins of humanity, that the original people who came to the earth from space through maybe some sort of portal in space, I think from the atmospheric combinations of Venus and Jupiter, and so that they're intertwining forms some kind of rift that could be used as a portal for these tiny crystal people to allow a person to be disembodied and to like manifest their non-physical form into a physical one, which is what Jesus did when he came back to life. And it's when that happens on an earth where there's this earth consciousness without any individual making it, it's like I think someone could have inhabited it and used it to actually connect their dream mind or self or their own dreams into the earth's consciousness so that they could control the entire planet with their mind. And maybe it wasn't the earth itself, but maybe the sun. And with the sun, they could do that to create the earth or summon it. So that would mean that stars themselves are the like ultimate form of consciousness without a soul. But what I meant with the sinister purposes is like I had this goal with studying magic that like all I wanted to do was I found the way to make myself do things the easiest or most efficiently was to not be ambitious about what I'm going to do, but about how I get it, and about choosing something that's very easily attainable. And when I choose things that are easy to achieve, then I always win. And that allows me to develop, I think, the mammon to choose larger things that I am able to achieve. And uh, my goal with this, all of this, studying this, all of it was just so I could leave the house and live on my own without having to get a job. That's it. That's what my goal was. And I haven't done it yet. And there are a couple of things I need to say before I forget. Is that there's this, I've connected some of the things I've made to completely, seemingly unrelated things that uh, I'd never played before until after I made this. So I didn't know it existed. But like this image of, well, there's the bell with the rhythm of four, like the tiny crystal people, which are made of these four dots, which could be that they spin like the four directions of compass, which something I've learned from Irish magic is that magic is entirely based on the four compass directions. And each compass direction has very different and unique properties from each other compass direction. And even though people can look at them like a compass and not be able to tell the difference, they are completely different and determine things like seasons and planet rotation and I think time. And what I think the tiny crystal people do is that they rotate and allow life or time to be intertwined with the life itself. I mean, is that life and time can be combined into what is known as the physical world. So when I learned that gravity is just time, because based on different gravities in space, it affects time. So if that's the only factor that's there, that would seem to indicate that gravity is time. And the thing with the black hole, though, which is just complete gravity without any material, is that it would seem to imply death. But based on what I know, is that the point of a black hole is if you go inside it, it's inverted. So it would be pure light. So in that case, that would mean it's almost like a pure light divine being, but it's only accessible in the physical world through the black hole. So it means the entire universe spinning into a giant black hole isn't a bad thing. It's that it's actually that gravitation towards the black hole is the root of the entire universe. So like in Zathura, I guess. But which with the floating house is like the story I wrote in the Perpularpy. And well, the thing with magic, like with witchcraft, is that generally something you learn in witchcraft that makes you very unpopular, usually burned at stake, is it's almost a sort of religion based on the idea that society, with all of its happiness and all of its sharing and supposed goodness, is all just lies. And when people try to expose them as lies, they get vilified and killed. So it's basically was used as a form of like street justice is witchcraft, but the people who used magic to try to punish people with their magic were just vilified for using magic at all and burned at stake. And one thing with that is that you learn that all of these sources of darkness in the world that normally make you feel this fear aren't evil. And you learn that the most, ironically, which is something people do acknowledge, is with God. So it says that in the Bible to fear God. And in witchcraft, you learn to fear the world, but fearing it in that you understand it as like an animal, a dangerous animal that is letting you occupy its same space, and that you abide to it to respect it, and it will respect you, but you know you can't just do whatever you want. It's that it's allowing you to be there on its own will. And with the magic, you learn that the world isn't a safe place. You can't just go out and eat mushrooms. It's like mushrooms are parasites. It's like you can't just go and eat a random fruit. It's like that could give you a disease, like with Adam and Eve. It's like you learn that the world is a very dark, sinister, and untrustworthy place. But also, when you learn that the most evil things lurk in the brightest light, that you learn that in the darkest places, like the things you are afraid of the most, are where the greatest freedoms are found. And that you find the most trustworthy people. So it's like, just like when you admit your greatest fears to people, it's like it generally reveals like who your closest friends are. Is not from talking about the things you enjoy the most, but the things we're afraid of the most. And maybe sometimes being the person you are afraid of the most is the strongest thing you can do. And the world works like that because it's true, and the world is a very horrifying and dangerous place to live in. And it generally makes you a very grim person, but the witchcraft vilifies the stereotypical Disney thing of like someone makes a frowny face, someone has dark features, someone is mean, somebody does a bad thing, that must mean they're evil and we should kill them. And that the smiling person who's upbeat and wears all these fancy clothes and everyone likes them and they have all this money and everything and they have all these things that we want. Like, those are the good people. They're good. These other people are bad. But I think with witchcraft you realize that of course they would think that because everyone's evil. It's not the minority's fault. It's not like every normal person is being manipulated into believing that these patriarchal figures like a corrupt president or a celebrity, like, they're not being manipulated into thinking that they're good, and they're being tricked into thinking that. They're the ones creating that. They're the ones who create the image of that person. And the normal person, the average person you see outside, is the most guilty person on the planet of doing the most evil in the world. Out of all of their neglect of everyone else in the world and the world itself, and feeding these idolized images of themselves by harboring them as real people. So, like, you can't really blame a celebrity for being this terrible person, I think, when they were being fed all of this pride by all of these thousands and thousands of people that only fed them that pride because it was their own pride for themselves. And they just used that person to create an image of themselves. So they never saw them as a real person to begin with. And that's why I think with witchcraft you learn that most people are evil. And people generally won't like you if you, like, the more aware you are of the truth in general, the more you realize how terrible most of humanity is. And that's like, I found when I've started believing that I actually started trusting people, and I was right. It's like the people I trusted after that never turns their back on me or anything like people used to when I didn't believe that. And it's because I think it's true. That's how the world is. It's not like we're all for humanity. There's no such thing as that. Nobody believes that. It's nobody, there's no collaborative humanity working together. Everybody is very selfish, and even the people who are actually good, they they're intelligent enough to know that most of the world contains people that they should stay away from. And that's how the real world works. And people aren't your friend. They're not. It's a lie. There are maybe a couple people who are. I meant people in general, but it could take a very long time before that happens. If you can be friends with someone and trust everything about them the first time you meet them, then you're being lied to, because that's impossible to actually have a genuine relationship that quickly. It could take years of being with someone you don't like before you actually start liking them. And that's somewhat fast, to be able to do that. And if you never do that, then you'll have all of these relationships that you look back and you're like, I was friends with these people, but then they just left and they're gone, and I never saw them again. And that's because they never were your friends to begin with. And I was surrounded by people like that. Everybody I've ever met in my life was like that, except a couple people online. Actually, just one person online, but everybody else was like that. So I actually am making progress with my life because I don't waste my time pretending I love or care about people, or people love or care about me when they don't. And when I die, I won't be disappointed about my life, because I'll know there is nothing else I could have done besides what I did. So anyways, I made a chart that's, I think I'm going to end this in a couple minutes. So, I remember, let's see. I created this thing, what I was originally leading to like 20 minutes ago. So I found all of these issues with radiation coloring, which is that I've studied old paintings and art, and I've noticed how we literally don't even comprehend colors the same way as ancient people. And I thought it was the food, but after everything I've done with my diet, it hasn't changed at all. So it's not the food, because my food is completely different and it looks exactly the same. And I thought it was my genetics, except uh, I've learned about other people's vision, like their perspectives of color, and I know that because of art. Of people creating art, as I studied a way to actually study other people's perspectives of color by learning to understand art, and I found that it wasn't any different, except in very rare cases with like oil paintings, like real live oil paintings. That's the only thing I found that can do that. Excuse me. So, there's a pattern I found related to like the coffin, which you notice is like a hexagonal shape, except it's elongated. So I studied how uh, I created this archetype of masculinity and femininity forming into life, which is a triangle. So like there's the seven. I was working on this when I was creating AI. This comprehension can grow. There's this arm hands thing from like a reminded me of Poppy's Playhouse, whatever it's called. As there's this song called Mommy's Here, I remember, where there's this pink character that's the villain that has like these elongated limbs that can move around. And this, it's like Five Nights at Freddy's, except it's a different establishment. And the character has these extendable arms that can go out. And I didn't know about that when I made this, but of that, these supposed cubes I came up with that are the foundations for reality, which I'm guessing are cubes because I just said that, and I drew one here, is that they are only accessible through these grabby sort of arms, which are made of that one material I'm trying to find. So it's like apparently there's this entire reality that is the foundation of the entire physical reality that is completely comprised of just one material. So I'm thinking, ironically, the way to access it isn't to find that material, it's to create a world out of just one material, which is something that video games allow because they allow everything to be made of just the screen, but it's still not physical. So it reminds me of like Lego. Everything is made of Lego in Lego. So it's like the idea of the metaverse, the most important element of it is the consistency of the same material. So obviously you would want to build up a large amount of the same material, which was what I was planning on doing now that I found two specific materials I like, which are the shungite. I was going to collect shungite cubes and maybe iron meteorite cubes, which I could combine their energy together, since one, the iron meteorite is like pure light energy and harmonizes with the iron in the blood in the human body, and the shungite, which is pure negative energy, but in the metaphysical realm looks completely bright. So like they're the exact opposite of one another. So I'm going to get mine that I ordered yesterday at like 4 or 5. It's this star shape I ordered. I'm going to get it in a couple days, and I noticed there's an entire facility of these metals apparently just a few hours away northeast of where I live in Louisville, Kentucky, near the Derby. Yes, is I remember the initials being MD. Is it Maryland? I don't know. I could look. No, I guess. I'm just wondering if maybe my feelings of disembodiment over the years have been the lack of this metal within close proximity to where I live. So that would mean I would be drawn to using the computer or TV, especially in environments that have a connection to these large storages of this metal. And the thing is that makes it complicated is that it could be accessed through the use of a server. Like servers are made in certain locations, and it could be that the game itself wasn't made in that location or based on anything there, but the server location is where the person hosts it, and everybody connects through their computer. Their code is sent to that person's computer. It is located around the same proximity to possibly these large amounts of meteorite or maybe even shungite. I used to be drawn to shungite, but it was when I was very depressed around like Russia, I think. But now, which makes sense because it's so negative, but it can also shungite can block radiation. And since I'm finding all of these problems with radiation, I would consider it a necessity to get more. Because that's probably why, even though I've been healthier, that I don't feel older, but I feel like more resistant. Like something, I feel physically resistant to something. Like when just occupying space makes me feel like there's some sort of pressure around me that doesn't physically exist anywhere. And I used to think it was all of the detoxing, but I've been rifing, so that means that whatever it is doesn't seem to be a specific disease. Uh, like it could, I still have diseases, I'm still rifing, but it doesn't seem to be that. It seems to be some material. And I thought it was because of malnourishment before, but now it doesn't seem like it could be anything than like radiation, to be honest, because I get the same feeling of presence like being out when Mercury is out, like when I'm outside, to like when I high levels of EMF, like when I've had my phone and it burns my hands because of the EMF. Like I got an iPhone 10 and I literally had burns on my skin because of how high the EMF was. So I got rid of it immediately. And the problem with radiation is it can cause scarring, which apparently I found that scarring is actually healable, but the crystallization of the skin gets disorganized, so it can get stuck. So it's like when, like, if you imagine your skin as like this replicating pattern, of like the tiny crystal people, where they all need to look the same to heal themselves or to harmonize so that they can like well just work together. But it's like it's kind of redundant if like the only way to heal something is if it's already healed to begin with. So it would imply, I think, with the human body that there is some other element that heals the tiny crystal people that isn't them. And I think it's a real physical element, which is why we're so drawn to the physical world. And maybe that's why we came here to begin with, of why humanity has found so many deep secrets in the world, is that maybe the reason they came here to begin with was to find this thing that the universe needed that didn't exist anywhere else. And while we have that now, we're lacking everything else. And enough to where it doesn't even matter anymore that we have found it. And I don't know what it is. What makes Earth different than every other place in the universe? Which I would think is besides the people, because the person doing that, who would have initiated that, there wouldn't have been any people to begin with. So maybe it's because of the consciousness of the sun. I don't know. So there's a couple things. It's like the rhythm of four in music is the four polar directions, or it's like compass directions. So it's like northeast, southwest, which would imply that it's two-dimensional. But it's like cells look two-dimensional. So like obviously these organisms here could just be cells or bacteria, like healthy gut bacteria, which I ordered my Irish sea moss. That should come tomorrow. So something I found is that the reason we have like everything in space is so large, I think the possibility of it is that hypothetically, if there were other space creatures, they would be very large compared to humans. And animals used to be very large on the earth, like dinosaurs and animals. Like they would just be massive in size. But for some reason now, everything has shrunk. And I'm assuming everything lived longer. But the idea that I found, I've heard it said that the reason they got so large is that they just kept growing and they didn't die. So it's like, apparently if something doesn't get old, it just keeps growing, and it keeps growing bigger and bigger. And I think the reason there was so much competition and death in like the dinosaur era was because death by disease was much, or age was much less common. So everything was much more athletic and had longer natural lifespans. But it also, everything was like a predator. So it was horrifying because everything was killing each other all the time. And that's why dinosaurs were so dangerous and why they would need to be extinct. And I'm thinking that people did exist during that time. And that I think they would have looked different. Like, they wouldn't look like apes or humans. It's sort of like based on what I found of like Avatar, where they would look more like more maybe feline or reptilian. I'm not sure. Then hmm, anyways, thinking something I found, the reason I wanted to bring this up now. I found that there's this image I made. It's this idea of gravity with the Earth. The necessity of multiple planets is necessary for the arrangement of time. And I found that apparently, based on what I've studied and like my dreams, is that in the dream world, throughout the centuries of prophecy, that I found that what is perceived in magic as prophecy or divination is really the correspondence with the dream world. So the invention of magic itself is the art of connecting to that dream realm and manifesting it into the physical world. And I don't know if it's actually dying out or it's just getting bigger, but is less accessible to the average person. So it's hard to say if that would suffice as dying out. If it is, I think being more alive, but also harder to access. And the thing I'm finding, like I found with like this image, is based on my dreams and the prophecies, whatever I found from studying the art of prophecy, is that the reason prophecy exists to begin with, of the prediction of time, of things sequentially happening ahead of time, of you knowing it before it happens, but generally not the other way around, is that if time itself is affected by the overlay of the solar system, and I found predicted that the actions we make will determine the events of the future, but the future does not affect the past, which could seem very obvious, except that there is a literal amount of time that always passes in this order. So there's a pattern to it that makes it sound as if it's almost intentional. Like there's a literal amount of days that can be observed for this process to occur. But the problem with this is that, let's say hypothetically, this other realm that is accessing this difference in time, which is why prophecy exists, is it's accessed through the dream realm, which would be the moon, the physical expression of it, which would be the labradorite crystal. So for some reason, it takes about, what I found is 3 days, like every prediction like my dreams have had of the future have been 3 days every time. All of my lucid dreams. So what I found is that something takes 3 days to happen. You would think from Earth, but this is related to divination, which is the dream realm. So in the physical world with the internet, it would be tra- traveling to the moon, which has access to the dream realm through the labradorite crystal. So that means it isn't actually coming from the earth, it's that the prophecy itself is from the dream realm. So it means that the reason we can predict things from the future isn't because our the physical world determines the future. It's that the dream world determines the physical reality. So what that means is the art of magic is learning to distinguish what is magic and what isn't, which is part of what witchcraft is the villainization of modern society, which tries to label itself as magic or excuse me, and or the a denial of the existence of magic. And what that means though is that now with the efforts I think of humanity with the internet and television and things like that, or just their dreams in general with the mass overpopulation, is that their dreams and radio technology are interfering with the dream realm. And even though it's getting bigger, there's less control over it. And it's almost getting so big that it's practically inaccessible with how large everything is. So the thing I found with this is that it's possible that the old gods, this dream world, could actually be interfering with their ability to access the physical world because they live in the metaphysical, in a spiritual, divine place, which accesses the world through the dream realm. Like the formation of stars and the formation of the earth was in the dream realm, but it was physically connected with the earth. So I found that the overpopulation on the earth could be why it is so inaccessible now. And that's why originally with humanity and with Noah's Ark is that humanity was very small, is that it could be contained that way. So there are a couple of solutions, is that you could separate people to different realms, which is basically like starting over, but also every human being uses the dream realm, even if they primarily inhabit other realms. So meaning like, let's say Roblox, like you could turn Roblox into your realm by regularly partaking in Roblox and spending your life inside of Roblox and dreaming about Roblox. It's like you could actually merge the Roblox realm into it, but it's only through the dream realm. So that's the problem with the dream realm, is that there are other realms, but you can only access them through the dream realm. So then it's like the problem in of itself is like you separate the control of the overpopulation of humanity by having people in separate realms. But the problem is that the only way to do that is through the dream realm. And so it's like, how do you fix something if the only way to fix it is if it's already fixed? But the thing is that you can do that with time travel. Is that, which is what this means. It's like if you hypothetically had a way to create, let's say, like an arcane of something being fixed in the future, it would be fixed even if it's not physically possible now. Meaning, like, that's where magic, that's like the deepest, I think, truth of magic, is that when you learn about the arcane archetypes, is that you can literally make the future happen. And there's something I found that supersedes even the dream realm, which is the arcane, which the closest thing I found to that is like a store that sells molds. It's like there's this, it's almost like the template of like every superstore or store, whatever. It's why I think money has so much control over the modern world, is that it is hasn't been realized yet because it was a complete accident, just like every other thing humanity has done. But it's except not what I've done. But is money, the root source of it is the really intertwining or interaction with the arcane figures that have not been recognized as existing. So the reason that people could have so much control or power over the physical world enough to stop these old gods from coming back, I think, and having control over the world in a very deliberate, like exact way, is because humanity with not with the study of metaphysics, because that would imply it's deliberate, but they accidentally created metaphysical devices that could connect to the root of the arcane figures that mandates the physical world. So what that means, like exactly, like in a very simple way, is that it's like this diagram. It's like, you imagine the top triangle is the physical world. The bottom triangle is the metaphysical world. The dream world is like this diagram that combines them together. So it's like the merging of the two. So it's like the in-between between these two separate realities. But the thing is that, let's say hypothetically, these shapes were created from a mold that is represented by the arcane figure. So it's like the inverted shape of that. But the thing is like, that's not the only process that is occurring here. It's like the arcane itself, what I was going to say with the thing I made, is it's what's it called? I made this thing called the Hive Quadrant. So it's like every thing in reality is created, like the root of sound, I found, is actually color. So what precedes sound is color. And like what I found with this imbalance of power in the world is really the access to accidentally discovering these highly divine elements that even the people accessing them are completely unaware of it. Which means, one, they shouldn't be aware of it because they could use it against everyone. And two is that, well, they don't believe it in the first place, so it might make it easier. But two is that, they literally conform like all of the rest of reality. So I think the problem that's happening here is that there's almost like this, what there are these stories I've had with Erazar of these people are called the God Kings. So it's very meta in that there's the world around us, which is the physical reality and everything, and there's this idea that there were these gods or God who made this reality, but there were these other beings which were called the God Kings, and they were so powerful that, like, and I don't mean in like the value in the life, I just mean with their literal size. Of like the way an ant is to the size of like the entire planet is with God, is that that ant would also be a god or God to the God King is as the planet. So these God Kings were incredibly powerful and were so powerful that they saw gods in the same way that God would see a human, is making them. And based on the story with Erazar, is that they were evil and all they desired was power. So the arcane archetype for humanity and their desire for power, and the reason they're so powerful and intelligent but also evil, is that their archetype is based on these God kings. And they were extremely powerful, but their weakness was that they desired power so strongly, they constantly warred with each other. And Erazard wasn't a God King or a god, but he was so just a human, he had to transform into a practically a god, which is Erazar, and then after that transform that divine form into an even larger one, which is the V-shaped helmet, to fight the God Kings. So he was a human who could battle these God Kings, and he killed all of them. And he had all of their power, but he was still a human being. So what he did was he sealed his form off, and his human body was still trapped inside. So he has the power to do anything at this point, but he was still human. So he sealed himself off and said that the only person who could ever open this chamber was the person he would give his power to. And he used, before he sealed it off, the last of his ability to be reborn into a new form. But that was the only thing he was allowed to do, was to be reborn. But apparently he found out later in the story that that same ability, his words apparently were so powerful that even though he meant to be reborn one time, he actually created a way to be reborn again, over and over again, forever. So that's the story of how immortality existed to begin with, was that that was the time when there was pure atheism, but with the God Kings, of that, the purest form of it is that if someone died, they never existed again. And they just disappeared forever and turned into nothing. that's how death was in that time. And that's how the world was so dark, and that people would just be killed for no reason. And they could feel more emotions than people could do now. There were more colors and lived longer. Yet there was all of this death and murder for no reason because the invention of morality didn't exist yet. And it was a very brutal world to live in. And the thing is with Erazar is that he was always human, but he could always be reborn over again even when he was killed. And later in the story he used that in his advantage, in that he was a very weak human, but he could barely fight and he always lost. But he could, whenever he died, he could be reborn again immediately. And he would use that to his advantage of dying over and over again. And then there was one way he could have prevented that from happening, is if he hid his face with a mask and he lived an entire life with no one knowing what he looks like, then he could finally die and never be reborn again. But in the end, when he was about to die, and he was going to pierce himself with the sword, and he spent his entire life hiding with the mask, and supposedly he died, is that he found out that he did see his face, is that the tragedy I think he faced in that moment was that he did see his own face the whole time, but also that the person he loved the most, he thought, was himself, and that the person he imagined never existed in the first place. And then he died. So when I was studying accounting, I found that there was something that drawed me in to it to even try in the first place. These lines. These arrangements of, I imagined them as spheres, even though they only look like circles. That's what I thought of when I drew it. They could be arranged up and down, so they're one-dimensional, that they can only be up and down. Excuse me. But it's based on the idea that everything in nature is formed by these lines that connect to these spheres. So like, how does a sphere exist in a one-dimensional space? I don't know. But they don't use sound or words, they just use color. So the different color combinations are a form of communication, And what I found with experimenting with that, with actually making logic gates with these colors, was that it actually worked and was much more energy efficient than programming. So I found it was actually possible to even create an AI, artificial intelligence, using a hex quadrant, or a hive quadrant, I mean. I called it hive because of the 6 angles, like that, even though in the picture it's an octagon. So what always, it makes me think maybe the hive, wait, it is a hive quadrant. Hive quadrant. So it's anyways. So I guess maybe the thing is with like a beehive is that you would think the 6 shapes themselves would be the shape of maybe the sun or something, since they're so connected to the sun. And I studied Rudolf Steiner, who also studied bees, is that they created that shape because of their connection to the sun. So you would think that would be the shape of the sun, but something you should notice is that they make hives, like the entirety of it. It's like you don't understand a house by studying the bricks. You study the house by studying the blueprints. And you can make the blueprints into a higher dimensional form with the bricks, but the bricks themselves aren't to be studied because every individual brick is exactly the same. So what I'm finding with studying the arcane elements is that even though I've been studying the materials that are used in metaphysics to create realities, in of themselves, they can't be used for anything. So what I'm finding is that real physical materials actually think they're not actually copied elements, is what I'm finding. And I think that's why I like collecting them so much. So the problem is, like with the scar tissue, is like if everything was exactly the same, then it could be, let's say, healed of scar tissue, but at the same time, it would make it easier to be inhabited and controlled by other consciousnesses. So that would mean that even if people could live forever, hypothetically, they would still operate under a hive mind. And I do know that because I studied mushroom cloning, and mushrooms attempt to make a human like a hive mind, which is bad because mushrooms are evil. And so something I found is like, I'm studying the materials or whatever, is that the if you want to study how to build up, let's say like a portal or whatever, to like the physical realm from the metaphysical realm, is you actually study physical materials. If you want to build a portal to the metaphysical realm from physical materials, you study the blueprints. That's what I found. So the thing is that the hexagon isn't the shape of the mind you would want to be preoccupied about to form, let's say, a portal. Because the thing with humans that makes them different than other creatures is that whether they like it or not, to not be an animal means you live in the metaphysical realm. So that could be spirituality or dreams or just the mind. But animals reside completely in the physical realm. But I also know that Jesus was able to completely manifest his metaphysical form into a physical one. So, how is it different, you'd think? And I think it's found in like what makes them different, because on the outside it wouldn't look any different. And it's because of the pathway, which is different. Is that something could be completely, two things could be completely physical, but their nature is completely different. And the nature is found in the path it took to get to where it is, while the pure physicality is just where it literally is. So, like, hypothetically, like with character, it reveals the nature of something. Because if two people, let's say, were extremely rich and like staring off into a beach, one of them could have just been born into it with a massive amount of wealth, and they lost most of it because they were stupid, and they just randomly picked a spot and just stood on the beach because uh, they just liked it and didn't think about it. The other person could have deliberately, they could have been very poor, deliberately raised up a large amount of money through like years and years of work, and spent months looking forward to this location and standing there and deliberately choosing to be at that spot next to that person. Is that some random person could walk on the beach and see them and think these two people are exactly the same. Like physically, they look the same. But the nature of something is found in the path it took to get there. And the thing is that Jesus reveals is that somebody, that there's a difference in physicality purely based on something metaphysical, which is character. So it's like something metaphysical could become physical purely by deliberately, intentionally maneuvering physical materials. So what I mean by that is sort of like with chemistry or alchemy, is like any person on the planet could have happened to combine these elements to create this material to make gold or plastic or something, but no one did because no one has the character to go and willfully do that. And it's so difficult, you can't accidentally do it, which is why it's only found based on your character. But the point I was making with that is that what the portal does with Hive Quadrant, or Hex Quadrant, I mean, Hive Quadrant, is that the thing with a bead is that it can't function by itself. It's by its nature, it is a hive mind. So the thing is that humanity teaches is like, what is the purpose of a hive mind? Like, a hive mind is obviously related to this sort of portal thing, because mushrooms hypothetically are a hive mind, and they can connect other beings that aren't mushrooms to the same element, which is what makes them dangerous but they also have the capacity to do that. So apparently, this hive mind is correlated to the hive quadrant, which is this. And there's this shape, which is like the combination of masculine and feminine. It's like the feminine are the corners, which are the diagonal angles. The masculine are the squares. But then you'd think it's like, you would think that two halves of the feminine would equal one masculine, but you would know by it being on a scale of balance that it would be equivalent. So it would imply, I think to me, that even if this isn't physical, or even if you can't visibly see a slope being equal to the amount of mass to a square, that it still is, and you would be able to tell by the presence of it, even if it's not physically there. But what I found with the metaphysical reality is that it's really just purely physical elements and shapes that are a higher dimension above our current comprehension. So what I mean is that this physical, like the shape, is really just twice as long as this square. So like you wouldn't think that based on this two-dimensional drawing. But that's how I think portal making works. Is like with metaphysics, is that you physically don't have the comprehension because there's no context. Like I didn't say that there was this. Like why would you somehow know that this random slope I made is three-dimensional and twice as long as the square with no context? It's like you couldn't just know that. It's like I made this, and that's why I know that. That even when I made this, I didn't know it. It's only because I discovered it based on a real science. Science that still isn't even proven yet. So it's like it seems like some foundation of reason that would lead me to this idea is the same foundation where you could physically see this phenomenon taking place, which is that frequency that makes everything interact with each other. So what I'm finding is that that same material that allows everything to respond to the same dimension is the realm where you could see the nature of everything on Earth. And that's the realm you would want to go to access it. In the portal, the thing with that is that with Jesus is that it's like the idea is that if our bodies are like clothes, for metaphysical elements, and then that could mean that images in the dream world could inhabit our bodies and control them, and which would indicate to me like the parasitical organism I've been finding that has the capacity for a hive mind is inhabiting the hive quadrant. So really the hive mind is affecting the arcane of the human consciousness, or maybe all consciousness in general, which would mean it lives in what I call the unseen, which is the space of the mind, which is, or the dream realm, I mean. Would be, well, now that I think of it, it would actually be somewhere else, specifically, is, the material is, the physical material is iron, the iron meteorite, and the realm, I think, would be the root of, I think, war is the disease thing. So ironically, I think the reason people argue or go to war or things like that is because that realm is where this disease lives. And the problem is, you can imagine it like a control panel, where this control panel is where a portal, I mean. Like this portal allows you to travel to this one realm where there is humanity's immortality. And the problem is that this disease hijacks it so that it doesn't feed off of the immortality, but it feeds on the consistency that forms the portal itself, which is the plasma. And the problem with that is that it could physically prevent people from living forever, which happens to everybody because of sin. And the problem with that is that any time a person tries to travel to that immortal realm, which would be the Garden of Eden, they immediately have to go through this layer of disease to get there. And I think that's why Adam and Eve weren't allowed to eat from the tree of knowledge, is because that existed, that disease existed before humanity wasn't immortal. So what happened was when they ate the fruit is that physically, with them physically living in that space, they ate the apple, which existed in the mind, the dream realm, and made these immortal portals infested so that they themselves could never look at God, which is why they had to leave the Garden of Eden and would be doomed to die, and they would need to eat food because they could no longer replenish themselves on that infinite energy. And the problem with that is that I'm just thinking, crap, is it would seem like maybe the reason humanity was brought to the planet was to find a cure for this darkness, for this sin. So it would mean a couple of things. Is that one, it was intentional that sin would exist in the first place, so that humanity was always doomed to begin with. And two is that I would think the reason they were brought here to begin with was to find a cure for this disease. And I'm thinking maybe the entire reason humanity was here to begin with is because their only purpose was to find a cure for sin. And that's why they were brought here to exist to begin with. So I'm thinking maybe with humanity, maybe the reason it is so independent, trying to be independent from God, we're bitter against God, and trying to do all these things of creating the world, is maybe this deep-founded bitterness against being used as just a sort of lab experiment, to be used to just find a cure for other beings without themselves ever seeing the end or that light. That all they ever were meant to be was just used. It reminds me of the song Machine Hearts, based on Near Automata, where there was a quote that said, "Glory to mankind." And I'm realizing that maybe the disease itself only existed to begin with as a something someone created. I'm guessing as Satan, whoever. They wanted to make humanity themselves. They actually wanted to turn humanity into something more than themselves, more than just turning into disease, whatever, being used as in a lab experiment. But also, I'm not a Satanist. And I promised to God that I volunteered to help rid the world of Satan, even if I didn't know what it meant. But I guess when you realize that God is human, and he came here to die for people, that you realize that